world because that's what Christmas was all about. Christmas was about you coming into the world to us so that we do not have to come to you. You are with us. Lord, as we continue to learn about Paul, Paul was an apostle who most especially wanted to go to those who had never heard good news before. Help us have the courage it takes for us to do the same, not just to preach the gospel in the safe places in our lives, but also to go to those places where people need to hear good news and have never heard it before. Make us brave enough. Give us the courage to be able to go wherever it is that we are needed. And Lord, we especially pray this prayer in thanksgiving and praise for your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, this is the finish of our, Art, come on in. This is the finish of our background on Paul. And there's a lot of material in here today, so I'm going to be going fairly fast. We won't be reading as much from Scripture as we had in the past, just because there is so much. I think especially when we get to the letter section of this, I put in more material than I needed. I should have stopped my research instead of continuing to go on. Someone asked me last night if I was working on a dissertation. I said, no, I didn't want to shortchange anybody. So. Well, I mean, that's the problem. You know, I read a resource, and I'm like, ooh, I should check this out, and I go read that, and I like that, and then he has a resource. And especially if you're on the internet, you know, as soon as you go to a web page, there's always a link to somewhere else, which takes you to somewhere else, which takes you to somewhere else. And before long, you have 20 tabs open across the top. So that was kind of where I went. So our study questions, which I can guarantee you we will not have time to get to. In fact, we'll probably be flying through the last part of it. We're going to talk, the first question has to do with fictive families. We're going to talk about what a fictive family was. Paul was really big in building what we are going to call fictive families. The second one has to, in what ways might Paul and his message have appeared to threaten the Roman Empire? This, to me, is a really big one because I think as I've studied this, I have a new understanding of just how big a threat Paul would have been to the Roman Empire and the reasons for that. Thirdly, we're going to see that Paul not only began congregations, but he also was about the work of nurturing them. And again, I think this is a new understanding I have of Paul, that worry. You know how we worry about our kids or our grandkids when they're away? I think Paul had that same kind of worry for his congregations because just picture him starting a fledgling congregation with a few people and then leaving and then worrying about what's happening to them. So I think there was a lot of that going on. We're going to talk about his letters, which were his way of doing his social networks and the absence of Twitter and so on. That was the way he did it. And then the last thing we're going to look at today is the collection, because he was about taking up the collection from his churches to send back to Jerusalem. So I'm going to try not to get in as deeply into the details. You have a copy of the notes, so some of these things I might pass over a little bit faster than we did last night, because I really do want to be able to leave it open. So if you have comments or questions that you'd like to make, I mean, as a teacher, I don't want to shortchange that because that's really important. And we had some really good questions last night. So the topic that we're talking about today, our last background of Paul, is what did Paul do? Again, like all the others, it sounds simple. It sounds like we could answer it in about 5 minutes and we'd be done. And in a way it is, because we could just say this right here and we would be done. Paul's mission was, bottom line, announce the good news of what God had done in Jesus. That's what he was about. Everything he did, whether it was writing letters, whether it was traveling, whatever it may have been, this was his ultimate goal. His ultimate goal was to announce the good news of what God had done in Jesus. He had experienced this on the road to Damascus, and so he's all about sharing that good news with everybody, far and wide. And he felt so strongly about it. I mean, just imagine the conviction it takes to literally leave home and spend your life traveling the worldwide just with that message, with that one end in mind. He did believe that God came first to the Judean people, that God called Abraham to start a people. Those people went through Abraham and Isaac, and we have the kingdom of Israel with King David. He believes all of that. He doesn't in any way abandon that or leave that behind. This good news had first come to the Judean people, and this is a fulfillment of that, not a repudiation of that. It's not overcoming that with something different. But he felt a special mission to non-Judean people, or to Gentiles. And we know that that's what he did. And as I said in my prayer, he wanted to go to people who had never heard this good news before and speak that. Yesterday, I just by chance was in a place and a person walked into where I was and we were sitting just talking, and he was a missionary. And I mean, you know, just by the grace of God, and that's all he wanted to talk about. And he was really an incredible person because that's all he does, is he does mission work. That would have been Paul. I can picture Paul just doing that and wanting to talk mission. Paul saw himself as participating in God's long-standing plan that through the witness of Israel, the nations would stream into Jerusalem and to the God of Israel. So again, he's not looking at replacing Judaism, he's looking at fulfilling it. And he sees them being a witness to the nations. So he wants them to continue being faithful to their God, and through their witness, drawing everyone to Jerusalem. Well, the 21st century is driven by electronic social media, right? We can hear news so quickly, we can get word to each other so quickly. I mean, do you remember when texting was one of those things that like a buzzer you had to have and you'd had to put it out? It was just like a separate thing. Now texting is part of our, I mean, that's the way we communicate with each other. There's so many people that I never even talk to, but I text constantly. That's the way we communicate with each other. I've even learned with my sister, she won't answer the phone, but she'll answer my text. So, okay, I'll just text. So we're able to communicate rather quickly. Well, Paul didn't have that, of course. Didn't have anything like that. And we didn't either. I mean, that's the one thing we have. We've seen all this happen. You know, we remember when letter was the way you communicated. We remember when it was a telephone that was attached to a wall by a cord. And all you could do is maybe extend the cord so you could walk over to the stove while you were doing it. I mean, in my house, there was only one phone. Even, you know, when I was in high school talking to my girlfriend, it was in front of the whole family because it was right there. I tell my grandkids that, and they just can't believe that. Paul created his own social network spread through disparate lands. That Roman Empire was huge. And there could have been places, you know, he always talked about wanting to go to Spain, and we don't know if he got there. But, I mean, I'd like to think that maybe towards the end there, when we don't really know what happened in some of those years, that maybe he got there. But even the places he did go, it covered many lands, many different modern-day countries. And the people he talked to were of all kinds of economic and social situations. We're going to find out, you know, based on the kinds of homes they probably met in, there would have been people of wealth involved in this, but there would have also been people who were not so wealthy, people that we would say were from the other side of the tracks, that if they wanted to be part of this, they would come. The same thing with social situations, people that were connected and people not connected. And so that made it kind of unique. Also, the pre-Christ identities ran the gambit of first century religious possibilities. That's what we talked about last week. All the various religions that were up and about and people were talking about. We talked about all the philosophies that were around. All of those things were things that Paul would have run into. It was a very pluralistic time. And so all of that is part of what Paul is doing and what Paul's message is. To Paul, all were in Christ, a social network all related to each other. That's why he could say we are all one. We're all part of this body. No longer do we have Greek or Jew. No longer do we have male or female. No longer do we have slave or free. It doesn't matter. We're all together and we're all one. Kind of a unique message pulling all these people together. And that's kind of a hint, too, of how this could be a threat to the Roman Empire, because he's really pulling people from all classes together. Okay, so that's not the divide and conquer, which is what you would want to have if you want to be in power. It's a uniting that can be a little bit scary to people that want to be in power. The church was the heart of Paul's social network. And by this church, we mean people, a group of people called together, okay, not a building, but they were a worshiping, serving, and supportive grouping of people. They came together to worship. They were there to worship the Lord Jesus. He makes it very clear that this Jesus is Lord. So they are there to worship. In addition to God, and we've talked about this before, we don't have this understanding of like a first and second person of the Trinity. We have sort of a God and we have Jesus who are both deserving of our worship, whatever their relationship might be. Serving. They are to take care of each other, okay? And in the collection we see even taking care of the people back in Jerusalem and supportive of each other. So regardless of where they come from, when they're together as this one church in this one place, they need to all be together. On the macro level, which means sort of the bird's eye view, if we look from up above, each church was a sign of God's end-time justifying activity that had already started in Jesus. So he saw, we talked about this earlier, that he believed that the end times were here because Pharisees believed that resurrection was the end times. And since Jesus has already been risen from the dead, that means the end times have started. One shoe has dropped. It's just a matter of time till the other shoe drops. So in the meantime, it's already started in Jesus. In the meantime, we need to come together for support. Paul nurtured these churches through personal visits by his co-workers that we're going to see today, by letters, and by the monetary collection. Paul didn't go just from city to city, but rather he went from large city to large city. Okay, so it was a selective process. And we pointed out again in earlier weeks that unlike the country preacher that Jesus was, going from small town to small town, Paul went to large places. Now some of those are obvious, Rome. But a lot of the others we only have ruins of. So you can go to Corinth and you can see the ruins. You can go to Ephesus. I'd forgotten which of those two places where they have the ruins of the 3-story library. And last night's class reminded me it was Ephesus. If you go to the ruins of Ephesus, you can see the facade of a 3-story library. So when you see that, even though you look at the ruins and you think, well, this isn't even as big as the villages is now. Well, if they had a 3-story library, just imagine that. That would mean there was a rather large place there. So all indications are Paul was a city boy, and he went from one large city to another. And then once a house church was able to function on its own, Paul left, and he went on the major commercial routes of his day to go on to another large city. On the micro level, okay, so if the macro is sort of the up above bird's eye view, the micro is kind of looking inside now. The Greek word that he uses here is oikodome, which means to build up. So he is all about building up. And there are lots of scripture passages that we could use or talk about here. This is in Romans, it's in 1 Corinthians, it's in 1 Thessalonians, it's in Romans, it's in 2 Thessalonians. The only phrase that I wrote down as I read each of these passages, knowing we wouldn't have the time, this was sort of my favorite concept of what he said. He said, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. So that is what he's talking about. He's not talking about great stature. He's talking about the love of this group of people together. This love of each other and of the Lord Jesus is going to build up this group of people. And that's what he's about, is trying to build this up. Okay, we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but this could be what a typical home would have looked like at this time. And we'll talk about the parts of that when it came time to worship. All right, I think that's it for that. So these were house churches, and the word that was used was ecclesia. I'm sure you've heard ecclesia. Okay, sort of the basis of our word, ecclesial or ecclesiastic. But we tend to think when we hear ecclesia, we tend to think of a church being like a religious place. But the word actually, the Greek ecclesia, is more than church. It actually goes back to the 5th century BCE and meant an assembly. And it was typically used for a military assembly or for an army assembly. Okay, and also back in Deuteronomy and 1 Kings, it referred to Israel when it was assembled to hear the word of God. That's more along the lines of the way we look at church. So the word really has more of a connotation of being an assembly. Okay. Paul applied the term to both local congregations and all congregations. And this is actually pretty brilliant. He didn't use a separate term for what was going on, for example, in Rome and what was going on in all of the cities. He still called it church. And isn't that what we do now? When we talk about the church, are we talking about the local congregation, or are we talking about the one holy Catholic church, as we say in our creed? Catholic meaning universal. So we still do the same thing. We use the word church to refer not just to us, but to all churches. And we see ourselves as part of that. We don't see ourselves as an individual that's somehow not related to them. And even in this day and age when we try to work ecumenically, we see ourselves as a part of many churches, not just Lutheran churches. Paul's churches did not have buildings, so he wouldn't have to clarify for us when we say church. You almost have to clarify what you're talking about. You know, people will say when they know what I do, well, where is your church? I know they're not asking me where my people are. They're asking me where my building is. So I will say, well, it's located on the corner of 466 and Morris. Oh, okay. You know, which one? There's two churches there, and then they'll describe steeples. Well, we're the building that's closest to the golf cart path. Okay. That's what people typically mean when they say church. But in this time, that would have made any sense at all because there would have been no buildings. In fact, it's not until the second half of the 2nd century do Christians begin to dedicate homes solely to worship. And notice, it's still not a church building. It's a dedication of a home. Okay, so instead of having, I couldn't remember the term last night, you know, progressive dinners, where you kind of go from one to another. Sort of early on, it would have been more like progressive dinners. We'll go to my house this week, we'll go to your house next week. Sooner or later, they finally just decided this is where we're going to meet. So my house would have been the one we would have used. So we play by my rules because we're meeting at my house every week. Absolutely. So again, that goes all the way back to this time. We don't have our first separate church building until 314. And remember, Paul died in 62, so this is long, long after that.
Where was that at?
I'd have to check. I can't remember. I read it, and I'm not remembering it. Same picture, because I couldn't find a different one, so I just used that same picture. Okay, it's a very nice picture, and I liked it so much I just did it again. Here.
That's a pretty big house.
It is, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. In fact, we're going to talk about that down here when we talk about these three things right here. So the synagogue at this time, remember, is still open to Christ believers because Christ believers are still pretty much Judeans. They're worshiping in the synagogue. So I was telling somebody last night was saying, well, you know, look at this. They're going to the synagogue on Saturday, and then they're going to doing their Christian worship on Sunday. So no one should complain about having to go to church this Sunday and then turning around and going again on Monday for Christmas Eve, right? Because they would have done this week after week after week. So, yeah.
What's the difference between synagogue and temple?
There's only one temple, and that temple is in Jerusalem. And since they cannot build any other temples, there can only be one temple. Any building that they build outside of that is a synagogue or any gathering.
How about today? I mean,
They may call it a temple, so could be called Temple Shalom. It's really a synagogue. Okay, for the Jewish people, there is one temple only, and that temple is in Jerusalem. So even if it has temple in its name, it's still a synagogue. And we also talked in past weeks, remember, synagogue is a Greek word, so again, it shows the Greek influence on them. So the synagogue is still open to Christ believers. They're going to the synagogue on Saturdays, and then they're doing their worship on Sunday. It was a natural progression to celebrate their rites at home. They don't have any money to rent space, so they're using homes to do this. And last week we talked about the home-based religions, you know, how people would have gathered and celebrated, you know, their ancestors. They may have had an altar set up in their house, a special area, a special part of a room that they considered to be sacred. That was part of Greek society, which goes back to the 5th century BC, all the way up to the current time for Paul, which would have been Roman, and they all did that. So it wouldn't have been uncommon to meet and have church in a home. So here are the three words I want to talk about, okay? The domus is a house. And typically it's a pretty big house. It's a private home for wealthier and more prominent people. It would have several rooms clustered around a central atrium with expensive furnishing and decorations, and an enclosed column yard. So this would be a domus right here. So you can see here's the atrium here in the middle. You can see the house kind of surrounding it. And this style of house still exists, right? I have a friend who lives down in Monarch. And they built several homes where they have like a mother-in-law suite in that. And one has a courtyard in the middle. And the main house is here, and the mother-in-law suite is over there, and they share a common courtyard. And when I first saw his house, I thought, wow, this looks like a Roman house. It's sort of the same style of what you would expect there. The triclinium was the dining room. So a domus that they would have especially liked would have been a domus that had a big triclinium. That's the Latin name for the dining room, which was large, usually holding 9 or 10 people reclining on couches, or without couches, about 20 people. If the atrium was used, the outside, then a gathering could comfortably accommodate 30 to 50 people. So move the couches out of the way, come on in. A few beanbag chairs, we're all set to go here. If the weather's nice, we'll spill out into the courtyard. And so this is probably the primary place that you would have gone. The insula was an apartment. So basically the two modes of living were a house or apartment. Does that sound familiar? It's still pretty much the way it is for us now. We have kind of a middle ground, sort of a condominium that's a combination of both. But an insula would have worked very much like the kind of apartments we have. There would have been rows of shops on the ground floor facing the street. The home of the storekeeper was usually either the back room on the ground floor. Well, their main home would have been behind the shop, and then their bedrooms would have been upstairs. Again, it's a model you'll still see if you go into the older sections of large cities. You'll see all the shops along the bottom and the apartments upstairs. And even if you look at our squares, they're kind of built to have that look. Because you'll go and you'll see all the shops. If you're walking the Spanish Springs and you look upstairs, and even though those might be offices up there, it kind of looks like that would be an apartment. So usually this was too small to accommodate groups. And not only was it too small, usually it had no kitchen or toilet facilities. And that could be a deal breaker, not having a toilet facility, because typically we're not talking about just coming together and celebrating the Lord's Supper. Early on, that would have been a meal, and there would have been, social time and talking to each other. So, you'd have to tell people to use the bathroom before they came because you wouldn't have one. So, and again, no kitchen, so you don't have any place for people to bring their food. So it probably would have not often been in an insula. There are at least 5 house churches identified in Romans 16. Most were probably domus, but some may have been insulae. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the church as a fictive family. The question was asked last night whether this definition only applied to what Paul did. This would have been a definition of going on already at that time and before, and I think we can even identify with this. A fictive family is a surrogate or substitute family. It's a social group whose members are related to one another not by birth or by marriage, but still, there's 2 things about them. They employ kinship terminology to describe their relationships, so they call each other brother and sister, even though they are not blood brother and sister. They see each other as brother and sister. And secondly, they expect family-like behavior to characterize their interaction among group members. And so a fictive family could cross, again, all social boundaries. And that sometimes causes problems, we'll see later on in the letters, because, like I said, if people from the other side of the tracks are coming, then there could be a tendency to not treat them like a brother or a sister. And Paul was very stern in his warnings to them. We are a family. We are all brothers and sisters in Christ. So I think you can see that we could still have the same kind of, anytime you have a group of people that you consider to be like your family, when they're not a natural-born family, that would be called a fictive family. Ancient Mediterranean people received identities from their families, so a new fictive family meant a reshuffling. And Jesus even talks about this. Who are my brothers? Who are my sisters? Who is my mother? So sometimes there would have to be, especially as the Christ believers became more Christianity, if you want to follow the Christ believers or Christianity, it may have meant leaving your other family who wanted to remain Jewish. Okay, but early on, they probably were still able to get along. Common belief in Jesus and common community life they shared. And unlike the Greco-Roman families, these were sisters and brothers. So instead of a forced kind of bringing people together under the emperor, these were truly saw each other as sisters and brothers of each other. There's a handout right there. It just happened to be left there from last night, so it was meant for you. Now, this will be the third time we've talked about honor. Remember honor and shame, which was kind of the main ideas that would have been important to people at this time. To Paul, he expected that honor was something you gave to family members and you didn't care about what you got back. Honor is important. You give honor to all your family members, and by virtue of being a member of this family, this Christ believer family, you owe them honor. N.T. Wright, my author here from this book right here, N.T. Wright says, for Paul, the significance of baptism was that one had come into a new family and had to start behaving as though that was in fact true. Once you were baptized, you were a member of a new family. Now you have new brothers and new sisters. Well, there's three potential problems. First of all, meeting in separate homes could lead to different identities. So picture a large city where you're meeting in more than one home. As the church grows, you can't just gather in one home. So you might have multiple homes. But not only that, for him, there's the problem of what about the homes in Corinth, and there's homes in Ephesus, and then there's homes in Rome. How do you keep these all together? You know, again, we don't have any kind of social media yet to be able to ensure everyone is doing the right thing. No one has developed a sacramentary to be sure that everyone's service looks exactly alike. There's no ELW yet. So they're trying to stay faithful to what's happening in the others. A second problem is this is like always going to the rich person's house, right? Because you're probably going to a big domus. So you're going to the mansion in town, and you might live in the little shack over there. And so this could lead to social and economic disparities. And Paul talks about this often, most famously in 1 Corinthians 11, from verses 17 to 22 and 33 to 34, where he is really saying, you can't let these be differences in you. We have to realize we are brothers and sisters. So our first potential problem is one house church could look different than another. Our second problem is even within one house church, we could have people who are truly not behaving like they're brothers and sisters of each other because they're allowing people that they may have thought, based on their upbringing, are inferior to them, okay? And I can see where that would be a real big possibility. Imagine always going to the richest person's house because they have the biggest house. You can see where that could become a problem. And then the other thing that happened is, I kind of joked about this a minute ago. I said, what if you all are always coming to my house? Before we're sharing it, we're going to all your all's houses. Each week we rotate. Now we're just coming to my house, okay? Well, my house is run by a male because that's the way it would have been. The female would not have been the master of the household. So I start telling you the way things are to be. Maybe I even tell you what to bring and what not to bring. I'm probably setting the time of day that we meet. So I'm dictating a lot of things. So what happens is you get this hierarchical model of authority under a bishop, okay? So the whole hierarchy that ends up developing, and even in 1 Timothy, which, again, this is the Deutero-Pauline letter, you start seeing these kinds of things happening. This male-oriented hierarchical, but you can see where if we're just getting together casually at first, it's great, but eventually, like any group, once you start developing rules and procedures, and this is the way it has to be, you start having a hierarchy. Well, how might have non-believers viewed the church? You know, the neighbors around, they're watching this. They're seeing people coming into this house, right? In your neighborhood, don't you watch and see what's going on? Say, oh, a lot of cars suddenly showing up at that house over there. I wonder what's going on over there. Well, the same thing would have been happening here as well as they saw people. Especially, you live in the best part of town and you're watching these people coming in who are obviously not from the best part of town. So what kinds of things, what do they really think about us out there? Well, this particular gentleman, Richard Askoff, said there were 4 possible models to view this new phenomenon. So if you are an outsider looking in, there's kind of 4 ways that you could be looking at this. One is, this is just kind of a break off from the synagogue. They want to continue doing something more. We were worshiping in the synagogue, but either they're not getting enough. The service isn't long enough. They want to continue doing this. Okay, so there could be sort of a feeling that this was just sort of a break off from the synagogue. They could have thought it's a different philosophical school, because remember we talked last week about how important philosophy was in this time. And there were philosophies going on all over the place. So they could have just thought this was a gathering of philosophical people. If you heard the words, if you heard people inside saying something about, take this bread and eat it, this is my body, take this wine and drink it, this is my blood, that sounds a lot like mystery religions that we talked about last week quite a bit. So they could have thought there's some kind of an ancient mystery going on in there. But the one that probably was most likely was, again, because they would see a lot of people coming in from different social classes as a voluntary association. And this is something that would have been, there would have already been models of voluntary associations. People would join a free will, they would be accepted by free will, and the mutual acceptance created certain obligations on both parties. That would have already existed in society. People would belong, we do the same. We belong to voluntary associations all the time. Anytime we join a group, social club or otherwise, there's usually some kind of it's not a written contract, but a certain thing. This is when we meet, this is what we're expected to do. You know, if I'm going to go play Pokino, I'm expected to bring this much money or whatever the case might be. So it's a voluntary, you come by free will and you're accepted by free will. And these existed for centuries in the Roman Empire. They were often called collegia, okay, kind of the derivation of our word college. However, the empire was wary of them. Again, as I said before, if you want to keep power, the best way to keep power is to divide and conquer. So what's the last thing you want to see happening? Uniting. And these people wouldn't have been from the same neighborhood. They would be coming from all kinds of neighborhoods. That could be seen as a potential danger, okay? And they're coming there because they want to come there. No one's forcing them to come there. So it was a potential danger for Christ believers in the fact that it was not neighborhoods or ethnicity that united them, but rather a belief system that made them look political and hence potentially dangerous. Now, all four of these could be found in households in the first century. But the voluntary association was the one that could have presented the biggest danger to the Roman Empire because they were already wary of those kinds of things anyway. If they were just coming together doing some kind of mystery religion, no big deal. Okay, if they're just continuing what they were doing at the synagogue, no big deal. Same with if they were just a different philosophy, not as big a deal. All right. Let's move on to our next step. How did Paul begin these congregations when he went in? And there were basically two methods: preaching and conversations. So if you learn how to preach conversationally, that means you covered them both. Notice both of these are oral. You don't see anything up there about letters. We're going to talk about letters later on. But basically it's all oral, preaching and conversations. So let's look at preaching first. In Acts, Paul first goes to the synagogue when he enters a new city. So at Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 10, we'll talk about him doing this when he goes into Thessalonica. Now, in the synagogues, you have primarily Judeans there, right? You have Jewish people there. But you also have Gentiles there as well, because both were needed to support the synagogue. And there were Gentiles who liked the ritual of what was going on and didn't necessarily sign on the dotted line to become Judeans. So there would already have been some Gentiles. Not lots, but there would have been some there already. And we know that Paul's interested in them, so that could be something that he would want to see Paul doing. However, as we said about Acts, remember our problem with Acts? We had to always ask ourselves, is it possible that this is something that the writer of Acts, which we consider to be Luke, something that he would have been interested in? Well, yes, he would have been, because to the writer of Acts, in other words, to Luke, Luke wants to show that there's continuity with Judaism about what's going on. Luke wants to see everything go through Jerusalem. He wants to show, again, this continuity. And we have to also keep in mind, Paul never talks about preaching in a synagogue in any of his letters. He never talks about it. However, let's see where it was. I thought I had it written down here. Oh yeah, here it is, 2 Corinthians chapter 11. In 2 Corinthians, he does say he ran afoul of synagogue authorities. Well, how could that have happened if he wasn't at the synagogue? So what we have there, in other words, is conflicting information. However, most scholars believe that he probably did start in the synagogues, even though he never mentioned that, because the synagogue would be the place where he could find both Judeans and Gentiles, even though his primary concern was Gentiles. So to some scholars, they would say, why would he go to a synagogue? Because he's interested in preaching the gospel to Gentiles. Why wouldn't he go somewhere else?
why would there be Gentiles at the synagogue?
Well, they were the ones who were there to help support the synagogue. And there were these God-fearers. There were God-fearers who liked the things that were going on there. They just didn't want to go through that long list and do all the things that you had to do to be Jewish. They didn't want to go through circumcision, ritual purity, all of that. But they liked the liturgy. So there were Gentiles who actually would go to the synagogue. And if they had money, hey, they would take them. We need your money anyway. So there would have been Gentiles there. And that's kind of unusual for us to think about that, but that would have been possible. But also remember, for Paul, even though his ministry is to Gentiles, remember we said at the beginning, he believes that the gospel came first to Judeans, and his letters presume that the people who are listening to him understand what Judaism is about. So he assumes that they have a basic understanding. And we're going to talk about that later on, about how he's always referring to things in the Old Testament and bringing it in to talk about how Jesus fulfills that. I said earlier in my prayer, if we go to somebody who's never heard good news and never heard anything of this, that can be very difficult because they don't have any categories in their mind to even understand what it is we're talking about. That's this missionary who I was talking with yesterday. He goes into places in Africa and Asia and places where no one has heard anything about it. And he just had one story after another of the kinds of things that he did. In Acts, it also talks about Paul going and preaching in a lecture hall at Tyrannus, and he did that for 2 years, which seems like a long time for Paul to be in one place. So again, this is Acts. Acts also has them speaking at the Agora, the Areopagus, and a lot of other Greek places. Again, it's Acts, and this sounds like places that Socrates spoke. So we have to look at Acts and say, well, he may have done it, he may not have done it. On the other hand, that's a great place to get a hold of Gentiles. Okay, they would be at those kinds of places as well. Paul also, according to Acts 28, has some rented lodging, which is possible, but rent was high. And it's Acts, so we don't really know if he had that or not. So it's possible that people came to his rented lodging. We'll talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about conversation. The house churches was most likely. So I can see him going and doing a weekend. He would preach the Saturday night and Sunday services, like all 5 for us. On Saturday, he would go and speak at the synagogue, probably not as part of the service, but probably in the back as people were leaving. And then he would come to their house church the next day, so he could speak to them then. So the house church was most likely. According to one theologian, an invitation to teach in someone's house would provide Paul with a sponsor, an audience, and credentials. When Paul says, I baptized the household of Stephanus, it is probably correct to assume that the preaching which led up to these baptisms occurred not in a marketplace or a gymnasium, but in someone's house. So most of his preaching probably took place in houses. And let's see, I think there's one other thing about this. Oh, there's a bunch of citations I have where Paul talks about the significance of preaching. I'm not going to take the time to go through those, but you can find citation after citation, and it's a full page in this book, that just brings up one place after another in his letters where he talks about how important preaching is to him. So it'll just suffice it to say that Paul saw preaching as the most important thing that he could do. That was what he most wanted to be about, was preaching. So again, I picture him like this missionary I was with yesterday. Again, we were just relaxing somewhere, having a cigar. Didn't know the guy, just walks in, and he's a missionary, and he was preaching the gospel. Just happened to be that here were both religious types. There were other people in this room too who were religious types. There was another pastor from another place, just happened to walk in. We just all happened to be there at the same place. But this missionary was the one who, you couldn't get a word in edgewise, because he wanted to preach. And he preached. And he even told me what God said that he's supposed to tell me. So I got a personal message from God from him. So what is clear is the significance of preaching to Paul. But the other side of preaching, and very much like preaching, is conversation. Conversation, even though I felt like I was part of preaching yesterday with this Michael gentleman, in a way it was just a conversation because we were in a small room with just a few people. So for him, conversation would mean having a one-on-one or one on just a few people with some people. Now, where would that take place? Well, the best place for that to be was his workplace. Remember we talked about earlier about how the workplace would have been the downstairs and the upstairs would have been apartments. So kind of picture a Starbucks with some apartments above it. So he's in there and he's working, and it would have taken him a long time to do his job, and people would have come in and other people would have come in. So this is probably where a lot of conversation took place. He would have worked long, tedious hours. He would have had time to talk, and he would have liked to talk. In the congested cities with living quarters above shops, his shop would have been like a modern-day neighborhood coffee shop or ice cream parlor. So his shop would have been a natural place for conversations to take place. And people typically would be walking along with their families, so he would be able to talk not just to one person in the family, but to the entire family. Conversations and conversions of entire families or parts of families. Given the normal hierarchy of Greco-Roman families, usually if the head of the household became a believer in Jesus, then the household would too, but not always. We have wives and slaves not converting in 1 Corinthians and 1 Peter. Also the letter of Philemon. When Onesimus' master, Philemon, has been baptized, but not his slave, Onesimus. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we have only a husband or only a wife converting. So there were situations where, and it doesn't really state why it would have been just part of the family, but sometimes it was just part of a family. Also, the domus was less public than a rented building, but still not totally private. Paul's concern that the Lord's Supper be conducted in a way that brought honor to the Christ-believing community and showed the world the positive sibling relationships in the church. So Paul was very concerned when he would talk to people about being sure that they were providing a good witness to people. So the witness of believers to non-believers. If we had time, I would go to 1 Corinthians. Do you remember he talked about the problem with speaking in tongues? He basically says, that's fine, but you might want to be sure you're by yourself when you do that, because speaking in tongues in front of non-believers is probably going to freak them out, so we don't really want to do that. What I would prefer is that you just do prophecy, which would be preaching. That would do more good for them. So he was really into what kinds of actions you would do when you would gather in the church. So that's one difference about the domus, these big houses. There still would have been, and especially if you're outside, it's not like our mansions of today with, walls around it and gates and all that. Typically it would have been something with easy public access. That's why you chose it as the place to gather. Roger Gehring has this quote right here. It says, "These houses played an important role in the context of Paul's evangelistic ministry by naturally opening the door to a whole network of relationships. Householders were able to create an immediate audience for Paul by inviting their friends, relatives, and clientele. Within a very short time after becoming a guest in someone's home, Paul had a relatively large number of high-quality contacts for one-on-one conversations and his evangelistic meetings. So he would go into these homes. Again, I don't think Paul ever met a stranger. I think he loved going into these houses and meeting people and sharing the gospel, whether it was one-on-one in conversation or whether it was a larger scale preaching to everybody there. But typically his preaching would not have been like what we think of preaching here at Central Campus. It would have been a much smaller group, more like what we would have at Lake Weir at the most. Remember we said there was about 50 people that you could get in a domus at the most if you moved the couches and had some people go outside. All right. So now he has established these congregations, and he would establish them and then move on. So how did he nurture these congregations to keep them going? Okay, and again, as I reflect on this, I think again about, taking your child to college, you get them set up, and then you leave. And you remember that feeling of, I hope they're going to be okay, and oh my gosh, I'm not going to know what they're doing. When they were home, I knew what they were doing. So when he was there, he would have known what was going on, but as soon as he hit the road, it's very clear by his words that he wrote that he was worried about them. He was worried what was going on once he left. So how did he nurture these new fledgling plants that he had just planted? Well, personal visits. We have indications that he didn't just go to a place once. He would try to swing back around. So we know that he did try to visit. He sent his associates to visit. We're going to talk about that too. And his associates were more than just, the Greek word co-worker is more than just a person I work with. They're more like really a part of me. They really had a close relationship. He wrote letters, okay, of which we have 7, and there probably were hundreds more that we don't have access to. Wouldn't that be a great discovery if someone found a new letter of Paul somewhere? So he obviously liked writing letters. He saw that as a good way. We're going to talk at length about that. In fact, I have too many details on letters, so we're going to go through them kind of quickly. And then lastly, the very last thing we're going to talk about today is the monetary collection that he would take from his Gentile congregations to be taken back to the Judean Christ believers in Jerusalem. So we're going to look at each of these in turn, separately. So let's start by looking at personal visits. Paul was a frequent flyer. Not the way we think of frequent flyer, but in the same way. He's not a 21st century frequent flyer, but he was without a question a frequent walker and a ship passenger. He had a restless energy that brought him not only to new places, but to return to places where he had founded congregations. As I said either last week or the week before, it's estimated that he would have walked, ridden by animal, or been on a ship for 10,000 miles. So that is a lot of traveling, Unfortunately, there were no rewards for that other than his heavenly reward. But so he was definitely a frequent flyer. Paul understood the powerful effect his sheer presence could have on a group of believers. Now again, think of what it was like early. He comes into a group and he's known as a persecutor, so I'm sure that people are a little wary about, oh, Paul's coming to visit us. Better hide the kids. We don't know what's going to happen here. But as his reputation grew, Paul coming would have been like for us if the bishop comes. Or even better yet, imagine the presiding bishop was coming to visit us. Then you get the idea of what it would felt like for Paul to come and actually visit you. And Paul, and many times in his letters, says he wishes he could be present. That happens in Galatians, 2 Corinthians, among other places, where he says, I wish I could be there with you. So he understands that his presence does have a powerful effect. But he also speaks about his presence having a powerful effect in an ironic way, because he embodies power in the weakness of his Lord. Paul is really the one who popularizes this whole idea of the irony of the opposite, that the power doesn't come through the way we envision power, but it comes through weakness. So Paul will talk about his hardships. Paul will talk about the thorn in his side that we wish we all knew what it was, or the thorn that he has. So he could talk about the power of God in that. So again, it was a powerful presence, but he always tried to make it as a powerful presence in a very humble kind of way of talking about through his suffering. And finally, he also knew his presence didn't always solve problems. In 2 Corinthians 2, 1 and 2, he basically says, we read it last night, but I'm not going to read it today, but he says, I know my visit was painful, but it had to happen. So there must have been a sense sometimes when he came that it was kind of like being called to the principal's office. Only this was even worse because instead of you going to the principal's office, the principal was coming to your house. Now, that happened once. I went to Catholic schools, and I was in the first grade. Sister Mary Catherine came, and it was not good news that she came. She wasn't coming to say what a nice boy I'd been in class. It was something else. And that was back in the days when if the teacher said you did it, you got punished. There was no questioning, especially a nun. So this Paul coming to visit usually could have meant we are in deep trouble. And we're going to see what that looked like in letter form in a couple of minutes. So I have a little cartoon here, a woman opening the door, and she says, you should have called first, given me a chance to not be home. So there were probably some congregations who felt that way when they got word that Paul was coming.
How did the news get around that he had been such a scoundrel?
That he had been, well, again, the only other way that news would have traveled in those days, either word of mouth, by messengers who would talk about what was going on. Again, it was great. They didn't have the 6 o'clock news to be able to find out. It was typically word of mouth, letters from other people. We're going to talk about the importance of letters in a little while because Paul doesn't invent that way. Everyone is doing it.
So he must have had a pretty important role in society, to be that well known for being a scoundrel.
Well, because he was such a persecutor, he was one of the biggest persecutors. Now, picture the energy he had when he was preaching the gospel, all the places he went. I'm sure that didn't come about just because of his road to Damascus experience. He probably had that same energy before, only in a negative way. So how did word get around? It probably happened just up the road. Word had gotten to you. So it wasn't just it was happening hundreds of miles away. He was probably making that same circuit, only this time he was persecuting. Okay, the second is visits by his associates. Okay, and again, there are a lot of names in this, but I want to talk about what kind of a person this was. The Greek word that he uses for this is synergos. A synergos is, we would translate that as a co-worker, but it's really more like an associate and even closer than that. So we think of a pastor, for example, and an associate pastor. It would almost be like a pastor and a co-lead pastor kind of thing. It would have been a very close person. This is somebody that Paul wasn't giving orders to, but Paul was actually talking with. And we'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about his letters. There's all kinds of people. There's Prisca and Aquila, Urbanus, Timothy. There's Apollos. There's Achaeus, Stephanas, Titus, Luke and Mark in Philippians, Philemon, Clement in Philippians. There's a different form of the word used, but it probably also included Mary, not the Mary, but a different Mary. And he talks about in Romans. And three other people that he talks about. So he had a lot of people. It wasn't just like one or two. We know about the Titus. We know about Luke. But there were a lot of people who were his associates. And we're going to see that when we talk about who delivered his letters. Barnabas was a best bud early on, but they split over eating with Gentile believers and the use of Mark, or John Mark, as he was called. So eating with Gentile believers, Paul obviously was on the side that you should be able to eat with Gentile believers. That Jesus would have done that. Barnabas would have felt, again, the tie to typical Judaism. We can't do this unless it's ritually clean and so on. So they had a split over that, and it did affect their relationship as far as being a co-worker. I've talked about Titus, who was his, I do want to read this. This may be the only passage we read today, but I like it because I like the sound of it. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 7. I borrowed this Bible from over there because I left mine downstairs last night and I'm still using it. And whoever used this before loved Galatians because it just opens to Galatians. So 2 Corinthians chapter 7. And we're going to read a big passage here. We're going to start with verse 5, and we're going to go all the way down to 16. Okay, so starting with 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5, Paul says, "For when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn. Conflicts on the outside, fears within." Let me just pause. See how Paul's talking about power and weakness. Paul doesn't hesitate to talk about the bad things that happen. So he starts right off there. There were bad things going on here, but Paul still sees that Jesus can work through that because Jesus would never have risen if he hadn't first suffered death. "But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus." Oh, the coming of Titus, not the coming of Jesus, the coming of Titus. "And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort you had given him. He told us about your longing for me, your deep sorrow, your ardent concern for me, so that my joy was greater than ever. Even if I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it." Oh, that must have been some letter, right? So we'll talk about that with letters too. Letters weren't always good news. "Though I did regret it, I see that my letter hurt you, but only for a little while. Yet now I'm happy, not because you were made sorry, but because your sorrow led you to repentance. For you became sorrowful as God intended, and so were not harmed in any way by us." And here's the verse I love. "Godly sorrow brings repentance that leads to salvation and leaves no regret. But worldly sorrow brings death." Oh, that's interesting. So there's different kinds of sorrow. There's a good sorrow that actually leads to salvation, and a different kind of sorrow that doesn't. So Paul goes, my letter brought you sorrow, but it was the good kind. It was good sorrow. You needed to have that sorrow, and see, things have worked out for the best. See what this godly sorrow has produced in you, what earnestness, what eagerness to clear yourselves, what indignation, what alarm, what longing, what concern, what readiness to see justice done. At every point you have proved yourselves to be innocent in this matter. So even though I wrote to you, it was neither an account of the one who did the wrong, nor an account of the injured party, but rather that before God you could see for yourselves how devoted to us you are. By all this we are encouraged." Okay, so there was somebody who did something wrong here. Everybody see that? And somebody who was injured. Wouldn't you love to know what that was? It doesn't say what it is. It even says, you may think that's why I wrote to you, but that's not really why I wrote to you. You might think there was something bad happened. Somebody hurt somebody here. And this letter comes shortly after, and he apparently addresses it, but he's saying that's not the main reason. "In addition to our own encouragement, we were especially delighted to see how happy Titus was." So obviously Titus had gone there, and he's come back, and he has given a report that Paul is really encouraged by what's happened. This gives us an idea of how important his co-workers were. "Because his spirit has been refreshed by all of you. I had boasted to him about you, and you have not embarrassed me. You all made me proud, the way you treated Titus when he came. But just as everything we said to you is true, so our boasting about you to Titus has proved to be true as well. And his affection for you is all the greater when he remembers that you were all obedient, receiving him with fear and trembling." I'll bet there was fear and trembling. If he was coming representing Paul, and Paul had already sent a letter telling them what would have gone wrong, "I am glad I can have complete confidence to you." I just love that passage. That is so human to me. I mean, there's several things I like about it. The way Paul kind of talks about this problem that was going on, the way he talks about how they've grown because of that problem, but the relationship he has with Titus. It gives you an idea that these people who were doing this with him and for him were not just people that were being sent to deliver the message. There's some conversations going on here. And Titus comes back overjoyed, and that makes Paul overjoyed. I just love that. Just love the fact that they have that kind of relationship. We have Timothy and Silvanus. In Acts, they talk about Silas and Thessalonica, because Acts talks about Thessalonica. Many women, this question came up last night, and we're going to see the importance of women when it comes to delivery. There were many women who also, Phoebe is going to be the one I'm going to talk about the most. We'll see her because she was Roman and she had some money. Not only was she a patron of many people, including Paul, and she not only delivered the letter to the Romans, but she probably read it to them as well. And we'll talk about that when we talk about letters. So, also I think we've seen in this that Paul's network between himself and his congregation was two-way. His co-workers reported back to him how things were going. We really saw that with Titus and the joy that he feels in that report. So this is not just a person who is sending a message and then they go and deliver it and they come back and then they just go back into the back of the line and now we bring out somebody else. There's a very personal relationship. So our second thing here is visits by Paul's associates. Thirdly, and this is where we're going to spend a big chunk of our time here, and we're going to fly through this a lot faster than I did last night, is the letters. Like with associates, this allowed Paul to deal with the impossibility of being everywhere, okay? Because he couldn't be everywhere, and the Roman Empire is huge, okay? In antiquity, letters were designed to overcome the geographical and chronological distances between people. There was a fiction that this was a personal presence. A letter was more than a piece of paper. It was actually the presence of that person who couldn't be there, okay? Have you ever received a letter that felt that way to you? I'm working with somebody now who is in the process of dying, and we're working actually on his funeral. And when I was over there last week, when he was in the service, he wrote letters to his wife, and she kept all those letters and she brought them out, and we read some of those letters. Those aren't just letters. Those are unbelievable symbols to her. And when she was here and he was overseas, those were his presence. Those were him being here. And when we were reading those, I was thinking of Paul, because I'm doing this on Paul. That's what Paul's letters would have been to these people. They would have been like a physical presence. But they're a challenge for us in later centuries because we're missing the other side of the conversation. So the same thing here. We were reading these letters, and he was trying to remember how he responded. Or she was trying to remember how she responded when she would write letters back. But he didn't keep his letters. So we only have one side of it and not the other. So we have the same thing here. Letter writing was very popular in the first century, as you can imagine. I think for many of us, when we were younger, letters were also very popular.
How many people knew how to read and write?
Well, we'll talk about that. Secretaries usually wrote letters, okay?
When you talked about Phoebe, who doesn't bring a letter, she was able to read, so
Yeah.
she must have been taught how.
And we're going to talk about that because that would have been a small number of people. So that's why, for example, if the Romans were sending a letter to a place in the empire, they didn't just drop it off and leave. They would have someone there to read it. Okay, but letter writing was very popular. It was a good way to be able to communicate. And as I said before, you were actually physically present because your letter was present. The size of the Roman Empire was huge. So again, you can't travel around. So if you work for the Roman government, this is the best way for you to communicate. And Marilyn, you were asking earlier about, how do you get news of things? Typically it was by letter. So if the emperor wanted the kingdom to do one certain thing, the only way to get that word out, you can't appear on TV and ask everyone to tune in at that time. The only way to do that is to send out letters to these places. The letter had become an art form in the hands of sophisticated authors like Cicero. And Cicero, he died only 40 years before Paul's birth. Seneca was the one who was a contemporary. Seneca lived the same time. So these two guys right here, Cicero and Seneca, had made letter writing an art form. Okay, so we're not talking about a quick text the way we do it. Unfortunately for us, the letter form is probably dying because now everyone's communication is by way of text and emails that don't have any kind of form to them. Letters, these two guys, Cicero and Seneca and others like them, turned letter writing into an art form. My grandmother wrote letters that were an art form. And she was a prolific writer, and she loved writing, and I loved getting letters from her. They would go on and on about all kinds of things. They would be 8 pages long, but they were beautiful because they were telling me all the things that were going on. Just ask Anita, because she used to love to read my grandmother's letters. Of the 27 New Testament documents, 21 are written more or less in letter format. And that may come as a surprise to you, but I'm including a couple things in there that you would not expect. I'm including Acts in there because there's actually some letters in Acts. And I'm also including Revelation because in chapters 2 and 3, there are 7 letters inside of Revelation. So even those books that we don't think of as being letters have letter format in them. And then after Paul, when we get into the late 1st century and early 2nd century, these people were letter writers. Ignatius of Antioch wrote letters prolifically. We have the apocryphal books of 1st and 2nd Clement, the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians, the epistle of Barnabas. None of those letters have made it into our canon, but they are still letters. So when you look at the form of how writing was of documents that are not in our canon, which I think would make an interesting class maybe next year to talk about some of these, they're still in letter form. So the letter form is a popular way of writing, popular way of getting things around. I like this quote here by Stanley Stowers. Something about the nature of early Christianity made it a movement of letter writers. Letter writing just seemed to be the big thing. That's what they did. Because of the popularity of the letter and the dry climate of the Mediterranean basin, we have thousands of letters from antiquity. Some have been around since antiquity. Many others are everyday business and personal letters that have literally been unearthed in modern times from garbage heaps or from the ruins of homes. Like I said, it would be great if they just were doing some kind of a garbage heap excavation and find another letter of Paul. I mean, it could happen. Think how wonderful that would be. Since we have so many letters, we can see how Paul's letters and rhetoric are similar to or different from the style of other writers at his time. So, we're going to talk about the components of letters. We're going to talk about letters as genre. We're going to talk about what the structure of a letter looked like. We're going to talk about, there's a lot of things, a lot of devices that we could use, but rhetoric is the one we're going to look at. We're going to look at forms and traditions for constructing Paul's thoughts, and then the one that is probably going to be the most interesting, the production and delivery of Paul's letters. I'm going to go through the genre and structure and forms and traditions kind of fast. I'd like to spend most of the time talking about rhetoric, because Anita told me last night that was the most interesting of all these. And then I thought production was most interesting. So I'm going to concentrate mostly on 3 and 5. I'm just going to kind of show you what 1, 2, and 4 look like. That's how the letter to the Galatians was delivered. We have the canceled postmark there, so. You'll hear epistle and you'll hear letter, right? Sometimes you'll go into a church and they will say a reading from the epistle of Paul to the Romans, or you'll go into another church and they'll say a reading from the letter of Paul to the Romans. So the question is it an epistle or a letter? And this was a big scholarly debate that kind of started in the 1950s. An epistle is a letter, but it's a letter written to be read in public. Whereas a letter is a letter that's meant to be in private. So an epistle is basically a public letter. So the question is, what are Paul's? And so scholars would say, well, I think they were epistles, and I think they were letters. No, I think they were epistles. And you know, some people just kind of use them interchangeably, and guess what? Later research says basically Paul's letters were both epistles and letters. So they were epistles in the sense that when Paul was writing to the Romans, he was writing to a public group, correct? He was writing to the Romans. He wasn't writing to, you know, Frank the Roman at your house. He was writing to the Romans. He was writing to the Ephesians. However, as we said, people couldn't read. So what happens to this letter? This letter that is written to this group here is read in public. So even if it's something for an individual, even if it's an individual letter from Paul or to a small group, it gets read publicly. So it has elements of both being private and also being public. So that's pretty much where scholars are now. It's kind of interchangeable. He meant this to go to this group. He wrote to the Romans to say one thing as opposed to writing to the Ephesians. So in that sense, they're private, but they would have been read publicly. So we're going to use epistle and letter interchangeably because either one of them could be used. The official nature of Paul's letters, exercising his authority as an apostle, makes it sound like it's designed to be read in public. It was like the Greco-Roman official administrative letters from rulers to subordinates. As we said, in the Greco-Roman world, if they wanted to make it known that this mandate was to be for all places and all times, there was a form to the language that was used, and it was definitely to be read. Because you couldn't say as an excuse, well, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that because I can't read. Now, that's okay, because it was read in public. Everyone would be able to hear what it had to say. So let me see if there's anything else I wanted to say about that. Nope, I think that's it. Okay, structure. This is not it. This is taken from a modern textbook of how to write a letter. But do you remember being taught how to write a letter like this? And if you're like me, you can remember, MLA style and all those things about having the proper parts. Do you indent? Do you not indent? Was it go to the right? When does it go to the left? Business letter versus personal letter. Remember all that stuff? So even at this time, there would have been a typical structure to a letter. First, there would have been the salutation. You know that you're in a salutation when you hear a word like greetings. Okay, that tells you it's typically a beginning and not an end. Paul adopted but changed in two ways because he liked using the Greek words for grace and for peace. So he would wish grace and or peace in addition to saying greetings. Also, the salutation would include the name of the sender or senders, the name of the person or persons being addressed. And Paul's salutation often contains a clue to his argument. So if you look at the beginning of Romans, which we're not going to do, but if you look at Romans chapter 1, verse 1, and go all the way up to verse 17, he's going to give you kind of a hint about what's going to be going on down here. Okay, so his greetings tended to be sometimes a little bit longer. Also, 1 Corinthians 1, he does the same thing. Next is the thanksgiving. Immediately after the salutation, Paul gives thanks to God for the addressees and or some other gift of God. As with the salutation, this can also give a clue as to what this letter is about. In one letter, Galatians, he omits the thanksgiving, which indicated his anger at the recipients and probably would have been picked up by them. So we talked earlier about sometimes if Paul was coming to visit, that wasn't good news. If his letter came and the thanksgiving was missing, the hearer would say, uh-oh, there was no thanksgiving there. We're in trouble. The greeting would be there. He would greet them, but if their thanksgiving is missing, then that means that Paul's angry. And the only letter we have where that happens is Galatians, and he was not happy with them. Next is the body of the letter. Like with the body of a letter we would write, these would be Paul's major arguments on behalf of his thesis. There's great variation in how he did this, since the life situation of his listeners and the issues to be addressed vary widely. This question came up last night. Someone was asking whether or not the body would be the same or have similarities. There are some. He's going to talk about who Jesus is and how Jesus is Lord. He's going to talk about what God has shown him and what happened to Jesus. But more than likely, it's different, because he has issues with the Romans that he doesn't have with the Galatians, that he doesn't have with the Ephesians, that he doesn't have with the Corinthians. So there are going to be particular parts, and that's part of what we'll be looking at next year when we get into the letters themselves. Each letter, the body is where he's addressing what's going on specifically at that church at that time. It can also be quite long. In Romans, the body of the letter goes from chapter 1, verse 18, all the way to chapter 11, verse 36. The next is called the ethical section, or the paranesis. Paranesis means advice. So this is where he either tells people how you should be acting or advice about how you should be acting. Okay? This can also be long. In Romans, this runs 3 chapters, from chapter 12 to chapter 15. And then finally, there's conclusion. In his conclusion, there's usually one or more of these items: a peace wish, greetings, a laundry list of instructions, and or a benediction. Some of the most beautiful benedictions come from the conclusions of Paul's letters. So sometimes, if you just want to be inspired by a nice benediction or blessing, just go to some of Paul's letters and read the very end, because he ends with some beautiful blessings. Okay, that's the structure. Number 3 is rhetoric. Rhetoric is the disciplined art of persuasion. All students, anyone who attended school throughout the Roman Empire, and even back into the Greek Empire, would have been taught by age 12 how to engage in rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is a different has a different connotation than to us now. We'll see this when I do the cartoon in a couple minutes. But rhetoric at this time was a way to make an argument. And if you were gifted, then you were taught all the way up to age 18 how to use rhetoric. And we know this because we found handbooks that date all the way back to the 4th century BCE of how rhetoric was taught to students. Now, when it came to rhetoric, it didn't make any difference whether it was an oral argument or a letter, because as we've already seen, the letters would have been read anyway. And a good letter reader would read it in such a way that their eye contact and so on would be just like they were giving an oral argument. And when these things were done, if someone was doing a rhetorical argument in 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ, these public performances were like a rock concert. Everyone would want to come and hear this, okay, because they would be interesting. Now, I asked this question last night. Did anybody ever participate in your debate club in high school, or were you involved with debate club? I think that's interesting. No one last night, no one here today. And some of you can argue like the best of them, so I'm really surprised. But Anita was sponsored a debate club for a while, and so when I was talking, that might have been why she thought this was interesting, because a lot of what we're saying about rhetoric is what you would teach a debate club about how to go about properly doing a debate. I had this cartoon earlier. I did this back in October. This is not what rhetoric is, but anyway, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. Time to do my own research on the real truth. The guy's at the computer. He gets on Google, and it says literally the first link that agrees with what you already believe, and he goes, jackpot. That's kind of the way we view rhetoric now, okay? Is the word rhetoric a positive term for us? By and large, it is not a positive term. If someone's using rhetoric, that can be associated as being the same as propaganda, okay, biased, those kinds of things. And unfortunately, that's not what the original meaning of the word rhetoric would have been. Notice that said the disciplined art of persuasion. Disciplined. There was a way to do it. You don't just fly off the handle and say, this is the way I feel, and I think everyone should agree with this. Okay, so there were parts of the letter for rhetoricians, okay? I got to look these up because I can't remember. But the exordium, this is where the person making the argument tries to get you on their side. So you don't start off by attacking. You start off by a little honey, you know? Say something a little bit nice. Oh, Kent, I just love that yellow on you. It looks so good, you know? So I'm trying to get you on my side. Next is the narratio. Now this states and clarifies the issue to be discussed. Very objective. This is the issue. Not how I feel about it, not how anyone else does. This is just a objective statement of what the issue is. Next comes the propositio. Not good at speaking this stuff. This is the thesis of the letter. So this is where I tell you basically what it is that I'm going to be saying about this. Then the probatio is where I make my argument. Again, very disciplined. So I'm going to try to make all the points of why I think the way I feel about this issue is the way you should feel about this issue. Because remember, I'm trying to convince you to agree with me. That's what I'm ultimately trying to do. Here's the part that's missing from so often from our kind of debates today. The refutatio. What do you think that means? This is the rebuttal. This is where I am, and sometimes you have to imagine what the other side is going to say. It may not actually be something that's been said to you. So again, if you're preparing somebody to be in a debate club, not only they have to be prepared on their side of the issue, but they have to also be prepared on the other side of the issue and have good counter arguments. So you see what I mean by a disciplined approach. You don't just spurt it out and say this is what you believe. There's actually parts to this, okay? Next, and finally, the paratio concludes the speech or letter with an emotional appeal, summarizing the major arguments and asking for the listener's assent. Now, notice this does say emotional, so I can get emotional here. This is where I can say, If you don't believe in this, it will be the end of all humanity as it is. I can get emotional in this last part, but only after I have made all of those arguments up above. Now, if you are doing rhetoric properly, you should be trying to address different parts of people. Okay, I shouldn't be just trying to appeal to your head or just to your heart. So these words should sound familiar. Ethos. This is where I'm trying to appeal to the character or credibility. I'm trying to appeal to your belief in my character and credibility. I'm trying to appeal to you that I have good character, and you need to believe me so that you too have good character. Pathos. This is where I appeal to your emotions. So it's not bad to appeal to your emotions. It needs to be in there, but it shouldn't just be emotions. And then finally, logos. Appeal to your reason. In other words, I'm trying to appeal to your heart and your head. Okay, not just one or the other. If I am a true rhetorician and know exactly what I need to do, I should have a balanced argument that can hit you in your heart as well as in your head. Make sense? And Paul was a master at it. Aristotle had three types of argument. There was judicial rhetoric. What do you think that means? Legal, which would refer to past precedent. So a judicial argument refers to the past. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say about that. That's in here on page 111. The method here was an attack or defense. Okay. There was deliberative rhetoric. This looks towards the future. Deliberate, as you can imagine, you're looking towards the future. This method is persuasion or dissuasion. I'm trying to persuade the audience to act in a certain way or not to act in a certain way. And lastly, the epideictic rhetoric. This was for the present time frame, and this was to praise or blame. Paul was good at both of them. So Paul picked up on these Aristotelian types of rhetorical argument. So we have this, again, another way that rhetoric is used today. We have a little cartoon today the teacher has on the board test today. Student brings the test up and says, I didn't feel the answers were necessary. All the questions seem rhetorical. Try that. See how that works for you. Again, another way we use rhetoric today. Okay, forms and traditions for constructing his thoughts. I think this was pretty long. The idea here, what I wanted to try to do was talk about there were several forms and traditions that Paul had access to. He had access to the forms and traditions that the Greco-Roman Empire used. He had his Judean roots, there were forms and traditions from that, and then there were even forms and traditions that came from these early Christ believer kind of thing. So I'm going to run through these kind of fast because we're running up on our time.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
In regard to rhetoric, could you summarize what you said in one simple phrase?
Rhetoric is the
art of persuasion, is that what?
well, it would be the art of persuasion, but it's a reasoned art of persuasion. I think that very first bullet I have under rhetoric is the best definition.
Because we use the phrase, that's a rhetorical question.
Yes, we do, and that's not.
Now, what are we saying when we say that?
If we're saying it's a rhetorical question, it means that we don't think there's any reason to answer because it's not really a question. It's rhetorical, it's just repeating it, and that's not what is meant by rhetoric. That very first bullet I had on rhetoric, the disciplined art of persuasion. That's the word I was looking for, disciplined art of persuasion. Okay. Now, I am actually going to skip this section. We're going to go forward because there is nothing to be gained from this. Let's go right on to production. The production and delivery of Paul's letters. Paul's letters were almost certainly written by a secretary, as most letters were. So even Paul, being educated, his letters were probably written by a secretary. First of all, that was widespread practice in the first century by government and private authors alike. We do have evidence that Paul, because the handwriting changes in the letter, and he says, I, Paul, towards the end of his letters, he may have actually added his own. But we even have, for example, in Romans 16:22, it says, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter. Well, that's pretty obvious that Paul's not writing that. Okay? Evidence at the end of the letter, that's what I was talking about just a minute ago, where the handwriting changes and it says, I, Paul, so it's evidence that he probably wrote. So he would have known how to write. How much did Paul compose versus his secretaries? There were some people who just told the secretary, I would like you to write something about this and let them have free access to it. That wouldn't have been Paul. Paul probably dictated word for word because each word would have been important. Although Paul seems to have controlled writing his letters, he refers to several co-senders. 5 of the 7 undisputed letters refer to co-senders. In Galatians, he includes with himself all the brothers and sisters who are with me. So you get the sense that Paul is not like a monk writing a letter in a cell. There's lots of conversations with co-believers that are going into this letter. So not just the delivery of the letter, but also writing it. So it wouldn't have been like this. Here's little Paulie when he's young, sitting there saying, young Paul writes an epistle from camp. It says, Paulie, a kid called to be a camper, set apart for archery and crafts, to the parents gathered in the hometown. Greetings. Oh, this is written well. There's the greeting. I give thanks daily. Oh, there's the Thanksgiving. I give thanks daily for the cookies you sent. I count all my poison ivy as loss. Written in perfect style of what one of Paul's letters would look like. He didn't write that one, by the way. But
That's very clever.
it was. So who delivered his letters? Certainly not Paul. We have no evidence that he delivered any of them. Most of the evidence suggests it was someone else. These are some names that he mentions in 1 Corinthians. I have those down there. Titus and some mystery person delivered not just 2 Corinthians 8, but it indicates that there was probably more that we have lost that they would have delivered. We don't know who the mystery person is. That's where I have a question mark. Phoebe, this rich woman who would have been very important to Paul, probably not only delivered Romans, but also would have read it. So you can imagine that Paul would have prepared these people how to read them properly and how to emphasize what he wanted them to emphasize. We have another couple names there. Okay, so there's lots of deliverers of Paul's letter, and not just men, but women. So Paul would have been kind of unusual in his time to actually have trusted women with this as well. The odds of a letter being received weren't great because of robbery, illness, accidents, etc. So there was no guarantee. So rich people tended to send 2 letters by different carriers to be sure one would get there. I was paying for my housing up at Gettysburg in January, and I accidentally sent 2 checks because I forgot if I put a stamp on the first one or not. So I sent her an email and said, I'm sending a second one. You may only get one of them, and I'll get the other one back. She got them both. So, sometimes you sent 2 letters, and both of them arrived. Once received, the letter needed to be read aloud, as we said, and the growing consensus that the deliverer was also the reader. So I love the idea that Phoebe, a woman, would have been very important to Paul, and of all places, Rome. This isn't the way they delivered it. Neil Elliott says, the effect of Paul's message performed orally would have been to create an atmosphere of effectual energy and orbit of power. We expect the creation of this acoustic space to have been the responsibility of the associate to whom Paul entrusted his letter. Thus, Paul would presumably have taken care to prepare this messenger to perform this letter as part of his apostolic strategy, for the letter had only done its work once it was performed. So these people were extremely important. They're not just there's not just a delivery service. The pen would have been a reed pen, and those get dull very quickly, so you have to keep carving it down. The ink was black, and it was typically came from the soot of a chimney, and it was formed into cakes that you would wet and then use the reed pen to write with. The red ink came from oxide, red nitrous oxide, I believe it was. Don't even know where I am here on this. It was red iron oxide. The paper, papyrus. The desk, none. Mistakes, the secretary would erase it with a damp sponge. And then the last thing we want to talk about is the collection. The fourth way Paul built a network of believers was by taking a collection from the Gentile congregation, designed to be a gift from them to the Judean Christ-believing congregations in Jerusalem. It's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 16 as well as other places. There are several citations that make it clear that this is more than just a rote thing. This involves service or ministry. If you remember back at the beginning, the church had to do service and ministry. This was part of that. Also, he talks about fellowship. It was a gift, or a generous, lavish gift to the Jerusalem church. The genesis of the gift came from the Apostolic Council, which divided the mission between Peter to the Judeans and Paul to the Gentiles. That council is the one who said that Paul would take up this collection. Okay, this, by the way, is actually supposed to be an icon of the Council of Jerusalem. The Jerusalem leaders asked Paul to remember the poor, which according to Galatians chapter 2, Paul was eager to do. Students of Paul have suggested 4 reasons why Paul might have spent so many years and so much effort for the collection. Because it's obvious this wasn't an afterthought. It's something he did very readily and something he wanted to do. First and probably most obvious was relief for the poor. The people that were going to receive this collection needed the money. So that was probably the primary reason. A second reason had to do with reciprocal giving. He could say, we are giving you money, now what are you going to give us? And so especially to Peter and the higher ups, he can say, we expect something in return, because typically that's what gift giving was, right? Isn't that what Christmas is all about? Also a challenge to the Jerusalem authorities. We have kept our end of the bargain. We are taking up this collection and giving it to you. You can't fall down on your end of the bargain, because the things that came up in the Jerusalem Council were two-way streets. And then lastly, the symbol of unity of believers. We talked earlier about how Paul wanted to be sure that all of the churches had a unity, not just house churches within one city, but from one city to another city. And he wanted them to have a unity also with Jerusalem. All right, we don't have any time for study questions. That came all the way to the end. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Speaking of symbols, how did they know each other? I mean, did they have some kind of a sign to...
Secret handshake or something like that, yeah. You mean as far as being let in or anything like that? No indication of what they would have done. If you look at, if you watch the movie Paul the Apostle, you kind of get a sense of that. They're very wary about who they let in. And I'm sure they would have been wary about who they let in. So I'd love to know what their secret handshake was, or their secret greeting, or...
Like in the catacombs, they used the symbol of a fish.
Yeah, and it could have very well have been, maybe if they had a bumper sticker on their car of a fish, then they let them in. So, yeah. It'd be good to know what it was, but yeah.
I just found it interesting when they used the word ecclesiasta, which had that military context to it, that if obviously the Romans are aware of this, and if they're using that word, it sounds like an attack on them.
See, and that's a good observation. Remember, the word ecclesia actually had its early roots were in having a military gathering. And here Paul is using that term for the church. So yeah, that's another way that could have been, because obviously there were concerns. By the time you get to Nero, obviously they do not want any Christians around. And so it wasn't they had a big deal about them believing in the resurrection of this man Jesus. That wasn't the concern. It was somehow they are going to, by them becoming greater, we're going to become less. All right, anything else? Okay, it's still Advent, so I can't wish you a Merry Christmas, but I can say enjoy the rest of your Advent and go in peace to love and serve the Lord.